welcome to the slideshow and lecture for Module 10, where we'll be talking about the High Renaissance in Italy. This is getting very close to my specialty area, so I'm going to do my very best to be as succinct as possible, although I could easily teach entire classes on this period in time and even individual artists. So I'm showing you just a really brief sampling today of what's going on during the early part of the 16th century and even into some of the middle part of the 16th century in Italy. We'll be talking about several artists you've heard of before and some of their most iconic works. Some of the major themes we'll be examining today include the importance of classical models. As the Renaissance progresses, this becomes even more important, looking at antiquity. Also, we'll see the rise of both religious and secular art, although as you can probably expect, we'll be looking at more religious than secular art. We'll also be talking about some of the major differences between what's going on in central Italy, and I'm including Florence and Rome in that category, and what's happening in the northern part of the country, especially around Venice. They have two very different traditions. And finally, we'll end by talking about the rise of this style called Mannerism, which derives out of some of the ideas of the High Renaissance, but is its very own thing. So while you're looking at this bad reproduction of The Last Supper, I'm going to give you some background on the 16th century in Italy. Following some of the 15th century developments we talked about, including perspectival systems, his strong interest in naturalism, conveying correct anatomy, and better depictions of three-dimensional space, we see that even mature more in the 16th century. These developments from the 15th century really reached their climax in the early part of the 16th century, and some people will even say that the High Renaissance only lasts between about 1500 and 1520 when Raphael dies, although I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with that. Some of the biggest named artists, some of the most famous that have ever worked, were all from this period: Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, the Venetian artist Titian. We're going to start by talking about Leonardo da Vinci. He was a man who was born just a little bit outside of Florence in the town called Vinci. It's actually better to call him Leonardo than Da Vinci, because it's just like saying I'm Jasmine from Philadelphia, calling me from Philadelphia. He spent much of his career in Florence, although he also worked pretty extensively in Milan and also in France, both times as a court artist. He is probably our best example of that idea of a Renaissance man. The notion that he was both an artist and a scientist, and he had this insatiable desire to learn, to explore, and to invent. There's actually a very small number of artworks produced during his lifetime. Not many have survived, but there's also the fact that he left a lot of things unfinished. He just had so much going on. You can see in his notebooks and his drawings that there's just several different things on each page that have no relationship to each other, because his mind was just always at work, looking to learn new things and understand how they worked. His drawings were almost always completed, and they're brought to a very high finish. And he did studies of biological, botanical, and engineering interests. So I want to talk first about this very famous painting of his called The Last Supper, which is on a wall in a convent in Milan. It dates to between 1495 and 1498. And it is a fresco, although I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how that's not exactly the best word to describe it. So this was done for the Sforza dukes who were in charge in Milan. Leonardo had written to the Duke, Ludovico Sforza, trying to get employment, and he wrote this big long letter telling him all the things that he could do. He can make bridges for wars, he can make war machines, he's really good at fortifications. Oh, and I can paint and sculpt just as well as any other man. So he was very he focused on these other things he could bring to the Duke besides just his work as an artist. This is painted in the refectory of this church, in this monastery, which is their cafeteria basically, and it's now in a rather ruined state. And this is largely because he was experimenting with materials. Instead of just having this be a true fresco, he decided to try to use oil paint and tempera on wet plaster, and it was even commented on that it was deteriorating just about 20 years after it was completed. Add that to the fact that the wall it's on is very damp, and it's also undergone quite a bit of damage from later time periods. Napoleon's troops actually stabled horses there and used the painting as target practice, and then in World War II it miraculously survived a bombing of the site that basically destroyed the entire rest of the room, but the painting managed to be saved. So a lot of reasons why it's in such bad shape. We're seeing the subject of a Last Supper, which is where Christ and his 12 apostles are all gathered for a meal, and it's just shortly before he's arrested and then crucified. So it's the very beginning moment in the Passion story. Everything about this painting, the composition, the arrangement, and the manner of depiction all emphasize the two most important components of this painting. The first is that we're seeing a really specific narrative moment here. He's chosen one moment in the story to tell, and that is right after Christ announces that one of you apostles, is about to betray me. So we see them all reacting in a variety of different ways. Now, the other major thing that the Last Supper represents is the institution of the sacrament of the Eucharist. Remember, this is the communion of the bread and the wine. This is the meal where he tells his disciples that you should eat this bread because it is my body, drink the wine because it is my blood. So there's two really important moments that are being depicted here. And in this last one, this idea of the institution of the Eucharist, you see Christ with his arms spread open in the gesture of a priest, and he reaches out and touches the bread and the wine here. So everything is centered around these two ideas. It has a very clear, harmonious, and geometric organization of the space. Leonardo uses what's called one-point perspective, which we've talked a little bit about, and your reading from Alberti talked about one-point perspective. The vanishing point, where all of the lines converge in the painting, is right on Christ's head. So if you look on the sides, you can see these tapestries hanging on the wall on both sides. If you were to draw a line over the top of both of those, they would both lead down to Christ's head, as would the coffering in the ceiling. So this one-point perspective is this careful organization of space. It's very close to how the human eye actually sees. Christ is also framed by the architectural features of the setting, so not just in the organization of where he's in the very center of the room, but also notice the windows. He's perfectly framed by them, and that central window is almost acting as a halo here. Now, I'm not showing you the entire room, but the use of one-point perspective and the fact that all of the apostles are on the back side of the table that we see here, it really continues the space of the room. So the monks would all gather here to eat their own meals, and they would see Christ and the apostles almost sharing the same space as them, elevated just a little bit above so they could all see very well, but it really acts as a continuation of the space. Things are also very carefully arranged. If we look at the 12 disciples here, you've got Christ in the very center, and then on either side you have 6 disciples. Each side has 2 groups of 3. And you can see they're all just talking with each other, looking towards Christ. Everyone has their own gesture. You see Judas right here in front of St. Peter and John the Evangelist. He's separated from all of them. He's been made to look uglier than all of them, because remember that Greek idea that beauty equaled goodness and ugliness equaled badness. That's also true in the Renaissance. The arrangement of the figures and the composition is also important for telling us the story, and also the emotional and psychological intensity of the reactions. So as I said, Christ is in the center and separated from all of the other figures. He's very calm and composed when you compare it to the psychological turmoil around him. So one thing I often ask students when we're looking at this painting in class is it a calm scene or is it more chaotic? Because Christ is very calm and everything seems very nicely balanced through the compositional devices, but really they're all reacting very strongly. You can imagine that they would all be talking at once. You've got these wild gestures, people pointing to the sky, pointing to Christ, trying to get his attention. So there's actually a lot of activity despite the fact that it seems very balanced. At either end of the table, you've got 2 of the calmer figures that are sort of bracketing or bookending this scene. There's a lot of incorporation of symbolism and additional meanings in this painting as well, especially in the shapes and the numbers. So as I mentioned, you've got the light from the window behind Christ acting as a halo. You also have several indications of the Trinity, which is 3, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in the groupings of 3 with the disciples, also in the amount of windows that you see. So we're seeing this idealization of the Last Supper, this scene that it was actually quite common, even though this is probably the scene you think of when you hear the words Last Supper. Leonardo's doing new things. He's incorporating all of the figures on the same side of the table, which had been done for about a century before him, but he makes it work. It doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense that they would all be gathered around there, but you don't actually think about that. He's doing it obviously because this is a painting and not an actual gathering of people in space, but he manages to balance out the composition so that it seems very natural. I recently saw this painting in person for the first time, and I was just absolutely stunned by it. I mean, it's considered a masterpiece, which isn't a word I like to use very often. Leonardo is considered a genius, another word I don't really like to use very often. But there's something about it. It's a perfect painting. It's perfectly composed, balanced. You get a really strong psychological intensity with all of the figures, and yet they're still perfectly harmonious. Their bodies are perfectly naturalistic. Leonardo and Michelangelo are both known to have done dissections of corpses so that they could understand the human body as much as possible. So it's a fascinating painting, and I could talk about this for much longer, but I'm going to go ahead and move on, just otherwise we'll be here all day. Leonardo's other really famous painting that I want to talk about is this portrait called Mona Lisa, and it dates to about 1503 to 1505, and it's oil on wooden panel. And this is a painting that Leonardo carried around with him for a good portion of his life. The reason that it's in the Louvre today and not in Italy is because he took it with him to France and kept working on it there. It's a private portrait, so a patron commissioned him to paint a portrait of this woman, probably his wife, and it's thought perhaps to be the wife of a man named Francesco Bartolomeo del Giocondo. Her name was Lisa Gherardini. This is something that the art writer Vasari tells us, but he might actually be wrong. But this is why she's called Mona Lisa, is because Mona is a shortening of the word Madonna or my lady, Lisa, and it was what women were called. We don't know for sure. We don't know 100% for sure that this is who the sitter is, but it's generally pretty fairly well accepted to be the case. This is an excellent example of one of his most characteristic techniques, and that is a technique called sfumato, which means smoky or smoked in Italian. And sfumato is this technique where the lines, the outlines of the figures, the differentiation of lines in the landscape, they all sort of blend together. It's sort of hazy, so that there aren't really stiff drawings. It's a technique of modeling that makes things a little smoother. You don't have harsh outlines like we sort of saw in Botticelli. We have this idealized example of female beauty. She has a plucked hairline, just like Battista Sforza did. Notice that she doesn't have any eyebrows. Now that might be because they were picked out in very careful single brush strokes that haven't survived, but also a lot of women plucked their eyebrows just like we do today. She also has this very subtle smile, and there have been so many attempts to explain why. I've read things like she doesn't have any teeth. That's the only one that springs to mind, and it seems so bizarre. But imagine trying to sit there for that long posing. There's some primary sources that say that Leonardo hired a whole bunch of musicians and jugglers and things like that to entertain her while she was sitting, but we obviously don't have any proof of that. It's this perfect pyramidal composition, and the triangle was considered in the Renaissance to be the most perfect form, that it was the most stable. You can see in the shape of her body that she's in this triangular form. We see her in three-quarter view, so she's turned slightly towards us, although there's a hint of turn in her shoulders. And this is a brand new way of showing women in portraiture. Before this in Florence, women were almost always shown in a profile view, much like what we saw with Battista Sforza. So this was a new method that Leonardo was attempting, and we see painters after him adopting this composition, including a couple of paintings by Raphael. I'm not showing you those today, but that's one way we help date the Mona Lisa, is based on when other people started painting portraits like this. The painting has been cut down on both sides just a little bit. Over here next to her shoulder on the left side, you can see this little column base. There used to be columns on either side of her, and you can see this parapet that she's actually sitting on a balcony, and you can see this arm rested on the arm of a chair. She's wearing this relatively nondescript dress. It's not overly lavish. She has this gauzy veil on her head, which is a really nice way for Leonardo to show his virtuosic painting technique. She's shown in front of this sort of hazy fantastical landscape. It doesn't really look like any areas in Italy. It's just sort of generalized. But we also see him using atmospheric perspective here, where things get bluer or more gray towards the horizon line. And it all sort of blends. The colors are sort of this harmonious composition together in the background, but also in her garment. Notice that her eyes also line up with the horizon, so it's very carefully planned out. This sort of hazy mountain and body of water with a winding river into the background, we also see this incorporated into later portraits. So it's a strange portrait in that she's not that lavishly dressed, which most women had their portrait painted when they were getting married and they would be shown in their best clothing. But we can tell that she's this noble lady based on her posture, based on the fact that she is wearing nice clothing. But there's a lot of new innovations that Leonardo incorporates into this portrait, and it was actually quite revolutionary for portrait painting in this period. So now I'm going to move on to a couple of works by Michelangelo. He was a sculptor, painter, and architect who worked primarily in Florence and Rome for the most important patrons of the day. He worked for the Medici family. He had actually lived in the Medici household for some time as a teenager, and he also worked for a number of popes in Rome. He has this very monumental style with very muscular and heroic figures. As I mentioned in the last lecture, he was apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio in Florence, where he learned painting, although for much of his life he considered himself primarily a sculptor. The work we're looking at here, the David, which dates from 1501 to 04, was commissioned by the Florence Cathedral Building Committee. And there were some political purposes behind this work. Remember, I talked about with Donatello's David that David was a symbol of the city of Florence. Also, the people of Florence would have known Donatello's David, so Michelangelo is differentiating himself in quite a number of ways from Donatello's work. So he had to work from a giant block of marble that had actually been worked on by a number of sculptors already. It had some serious flaws. It was a very shallow block. It was this very difficult task, but he had already proved himself by sculpting the Pietà that's now in the Vatican that he did in Rome for a cardinal, so they knew that he could be tasked with such an assignment, and this really made his career. What we're seeing is this idealized, heroic male nude. We see lots of classical influence in the athlete form, this idealized male figure, the perfect musculature, the contrapposto, which is a bit exaggerated, but remember I said that this block was flawed, which is part of the reason his lean is so strange and that his leg goes out so far. With the contrapposto, we see this balance of opposites emphasizing this idealized pose, and it's diagonally organized. So in the same way with that X shape across the body of the Doryphorus, we have the same thing going on here with the X formed across his body with the free leg, free arm, weighted leg, and weighted arm. So we see David here, who is typically depicted and thought of as a teenager, shown as, I don't know, how old do we think he is? Very late teens, early 20s, something like that. We see him here before the battle. Instead of like with Donatello's where the head was down at his feet, we see him getting ready, preparing himself to go fight Goliath. And it's hard to see in this image, but in the hand that's down here near his leg, he's holding a stone. And on his shoulder up here, he has his slingshot laying over his shoulder. So we see him in this physical and mental state of preparation, and he's looking over to the side as if maybe he sees Goliath over there, and he's looking ahead to what's to come. Now, from this view, he looks very much in control and not worried at all, this very powerful figure. But in fact, if you see details of his face, he's got this furrowed brow and this intense expression that almost looks like worry, because imagine if you are about to go fight this giant who has defeated everybody else before you. You would be very scared. So you have this intense strength and just intensity in general in this figure. It's not self-contained like Donatello's that we saw, where the David is just looking down toward the head of Goliath. Instead, this David looks out away from him. And there's this distinct difference in the age and moment of the story that Michelangelo has chosen versus what Donatello chose to do. So this was originally intended to be put up high above, next to the dome of the Florence Cathedral on one of the buttresses. That's one reason it's so huge. So it was meant to be seen from below. Now this explains a couple of things that people often point out, that there's a couple of problems with it actually. Look how huge his hands are, and also how large his head is. His hair is this enormous mop that's so heavy it doesn't even look like real hair almost. And this is probably one of Michelangelo's strategies for making it seem naturalistic for the viewer standing on the ground something like 70 feet below. Now when it was finished, people were so impressed with it that they actually formed a committee of artists, architects, and various townspeople to talk about where it should actually be placed. Some people agreed that it should be placed in its original location, up on top of the buttress like it had been planned. Some people, Leonardo da Vinci included, thought it should stand in front of the cathedral itself, but down at ground level. Others thought that it should go in this loggia, which is this little covered area that was near the city hall, with other sculptures that were displayed there. But finally, what was decided on is that he should stand in front of the main door of the Palazzo della Signoria of City Hall, and he was placed very carefully, so he's looking south towards Rome. And in this period that this was created, the Pope was really interested in expanding his territory, and the Florentines were a little nervous about the encroachments that the popes were making. So this major symbol of Florence is then put in front of the city hall, not too far away from Donatello's David was. It became this really important symbol for the city. When I first took art history, my professor talked about if she had to teach the Renaissance in a single monument, this is the one she would choose because of its strong interest in classical antiquity with the idealized nude form. Also, though, the biblical story is very important to the Renaissance idea here, but also because of the naturalism of the form. Michelangelo knew the body. As I said, he did dissections. You can see the tendons in his neck. He goes even so far as to make the veining in each hand different. The veins in the lower hand, the one that's down below his heart, the veins are engorged with blood, whereas the one that's up above his heart, where the blood would be draining out, the veins aren't engorged in the same way. So he's really thinking about how to make this seem as naturalistic as possible. I'd like to now move on to the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Probably the work that Michelangelo is also most famous for. If you had to name one work by Michelangelo, I imagine you would probably say the Sistine Chapel or the David. This was commissioned by a pope named Julius II, who was pope from 1503 to 1513. This was the Pope's private chapel built by Julius II's uncle named Sixtus IV. That's why it's called the Sistine Chapel, named after Sixtus. And Sixtus IV had some of the walls decorated, but Julius II decided he wanted to put his mark on his uncle's chapel. And so he had him paint the ceiling, the pendentives that we see, these triangular spaces, and also the lunettes above the windows, which we can see all of these in this space here. Julius II had brought Michelangelo to Rome shortly after he finished the David because he wanted him to construct his tomb, design and construct this enormous tomb, which was planned to have 40 life-size sculptures. It was going to be enormous. It doesn't ever get quite finished the way he hopes. And one of the reasons is because Julius II said, never mind, Michelangelo, I want you to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling instead. Michelangelo really didn't want to. He kept saying over and over that he preferred to do sculpture, but obviously we know he was a trained painter because he apprenticed to Ghirlandaio at Florence. It took him 4 years to finish this. He had lots of problems along the way. Mold grew on the plaster because his composition of the fresco materials didn't work for Rome like they did for Florence. He mostly worked by himself, but he is known to have probably had a few assistants at least. So let's talk about what we're seeing in this enormous fresco cycle. It's huge and it's very complex. It goes across the entire ceiling from end to end. It incorporates the agenda of Pope Julius II, important church doctrine, and it also conveyed Michelangelo's own interest as an artist. What we're seeing here is the creation, fall, and redemption of humanity. He almost certainly had a theological advisor working with him, and it works very well with the program that had already been painted in it under Sixtus IV. So down below the windows you have scenes from the life of Moses, the Old Law, and scenes from the life of Christ, the New Law. And these are the two laws that come before modern Catholicism. And so the papacy was seen as the descendant of these two laws. So on the ceiling, we have, in the center of it, we have scenes from the book of Genesis. At this end, which is near the altar wall on the left side, you have 3 scenes of God's creation. Then you have 3 scenes of the creation and fall of Adam and Eve. And then finally, 3 scenes from the story of Noah. And these all work together to show man's need for salvation. So showing the fall of man and the time of the flood when God had to wipe everybody out completely and start fresh, which goes very well with the stories below, with the life of Moses and the life of Christ, continuing the story of humanity. The scenes are shown in reverse order from where people would enter, so even though I'm not showing you a wide view of the chapel, remember this scene of God is on the altar wall, but people would come in at the entrance wall over here. So right over their head were scenes from Noah. And it took me years to understand this, and I finally figured it out after going to the Sistine Chapel several times. But the reason is because from this back end of the space, where regular people could go, not everybody could just go up to the altar. This way you can read the entire scene, you can read the entire cycle from beginning to end. You can see the entire range of the frescoes from the back wall, and you don't have to crane your neck terribly. So those are the central scenes. Then around them you have these nude figures who are holding these bronze roundels. These are called the ignudi, the nude figures. And it's showing Michelangelo's interest in the male nude, which was seen as the perfect form. Remember, we have this idea of humanism. Down below the scenes on either side, we have 12 prophets and sibyls. And sibyls are female prophets who were not from the Bible, but they were considered to have foretold of the coming of Christ to the non-Jewish peoples around the world. Then in the pendentives and in the lunettes, we have the ancestors of Christ. So at the beginning of the gospel books, you often have these long lineages of Christ where they say this person beget this person, beget this person. And they're all nicely labeled for us. They're all sitting doing everyday activities, feeding their children, sleeping, sewing, because they don't know their role in the history of salvation, but they play an important part. So that's one theory about why they're not shown as being very active necessarily. So I want to talk about a couple of details in particular. Here, for example, I'm showing you the temptation and fall of Adam and Eve. So we see this incredible snake. You see the colors on this orange melting into green. It's a really incredible figure. This tree dividing the 2 parts of the story. Adam and Eve are nude in the Garden of Eden. Eve reaches up to the hand of the serpent while Adam reaches into the tree to grab his own fruit. And they're about to do exactly what God told them not to do, which was to eat from that tree. And they are punished for it. The angel drives them out of the garden into this barren landscape, and they have now fallen into sin. So this is the moment for man's need for redemption, which they get through the coming of Christ. One detail I love here is that you notice the faces of Adam and Eve here. Look how different they look on this side. They're old and haggard. They've changed so dramatically, leaving paradise. They become these other sorts of people. And then I wanted to show you the most famous scene in the chapel. Here at the very center, we have the creation of Adam. On the right side, we see God flying in with this whole posse of angels and a couple of other figures that scholars have spent a long time trying to identify. He's this huge muscular figure. He looks very similar to the other depictions of God in the creation scenes. Under his arm, he has this female figure who has been interpreted as perhaps the Virgin Mary, perhaps Eve, perhaps the idea of wisdom. And then you have this little baby figure here, which is typically interpreted as Christ. They're all with him at the moment of creation, although they're part of him, they're not created yet. And then you see Adam reclining, almost like a river god, reclining on this barren landscape, this perfect idealized form. You see how languid his pose is, how lethargic he looks, and they're just about to touch fingers, which is going to be the moment he's given life, essentially. The spark of life will come. But there's actually a lot of tension here. You get a lot of movement, a lot of anticipation in that those 2 fingers about to touch. Michelangelo focused in the ceiling on monumental figures because it needed to be seen from the floor below. So that's one of the reasons that the figures are so large. He figured out along the way that he needed to reduce the number of figures. So in the scenes of the flood of Noah, which are the first scenes he does, there's so many more figures and much more difficult to read. He changes pretty considerably over the course of 4 years, where he's working very carefully from drawings, and then towards the end he starts painting freehand, doing huge patches, huge giornate, daily patches of fresco that are just almost unheard of, but he is virtuosic, completely and utterly virtuosic. The ceiling was restored about 20 years ago now. They did a huge campaign of cleaning, and it really changed the interpretation of the ceiling. People used to think that Michelangelo didn't know how to use color, that he was a sculptor, that he wasn't interested in painterly effects, that it was a pessimistic view of creation. But after it was cleaned and people saw the brilliant colors, like with the snake here or the brilliant red of the angel's cloak, we know that Michelangelo instead was really innovative with his use of color, and that we can't just classify him as a sculptor only. So to keep moving, I'd like to now talk about this famous work by Raphael called the School of Athens. It's in the Vatican Palace as well, really not too far from the Sistine Chapel, in a room called the Stanza della Segnatura, and it dates from 1509 to 1511. So he was working on this fresco at the same time that Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. This is also commissioned by Pope Julius II. These were his private apartments that he just had built, and he commissioned Raphael to paint several of them, and after Raphael dies, his students finished the project. Raphael's not a Florentine artist. He's from a city in Umbria called Urbino, although he did work for a period of time in Florence. There's actually a moment in time where Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael are all in Florence at once. He is by far the most influential of the three big-name artists for his contemporaries as well as artists of later generations. He combines the strength and sculptural quality of Michelangelo with a beauty and refined grace from the earlier part of the Renaissance. In this room, I'm just going to show you this one painting, but I want to mention what's on the other walls. You've got scenes of the four main bodies of knowledge, one on each wall. So the School of Athens is the philosophy wall, but there's also a wall about theology, one about law, and one about poetry. So these are the four main things that a library would contain, and this was almost certainly the library of Julius II while he was alive. It's a very highly intellectual theme, unifying the entire room, which emphasizes the erudition of the Pope, showing Julius II as a humanist. He was a huge patron of the arts. He's the one who started the building of New St. Peter's, which is the church that stands today. He was also a serious warrior pope. He marched into battle as a 70-year-old man, so he had a lot of ambitions for the papacy. So in the School of Athens, this is the most famous of the frescoes that he does. We're seeing this idea of philosophy. So this isn't an event that could possibly ever have taken place. We're seeing it in a classical setting, which has often been compared to what Roman baths look like, or maybe very much what St. Peter's, the construction site of St. Peter's, looked like at that point. So you see these huge barrel vaults and these huge piers. These are the earliest things built to support the dome that's built later. You have this congregation of great philosophers and scientists of the ancient world conversing and sharing their ideas and discoveries. Many of these men and their writings were newly rediscovered during the Renaissance. Just like with the Last Supper, we have one-point perspective converging right here in the center of the two central figures. You can see the lines of the architecture leading down to this area. On the left side, we have Plato, who is gesturing towards the heavens, and on the right side, we have Aristotle, who has his hand out gesturing towards the earth. This is them debating the origins of knowledge, because Plato's writings, which actually Aristotle did, but Plato's writings say that knowledge comes from above. You have an innate sense of knowledge. You're born with your capacities. Whereas Aristotle argued that it was empirical, based on experience, this nature versus nurture idea. They're surrounded by a number of other identifiable philosophers. Some people say that this figure laying on the steps here is Socrates, although we don't know that for sure. This also has Pythagoras and Euclid, so many other figures. I'm not going to go through them all right now. What's really fascinating about this is that Raphael included portraits of many of his contemporaries. So, for example, this figure of Plato is a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. This figure over here, Euclid, who's bent down and drawing with a compass, is a portrait of his cousin named Bramante. Bramante was the architect for Julius II, the first one of New St. Peter's. He's probably the way that Raphael got the job working for Julius II. Raphael has included his portrait over here, the figure in the red cloak and black cap, second from the right. And it's thought that maybe originally he wanted to show himself as Aristotle because the cartoon, the full-scale finished drawing for this survives. And Aristotle had a different face, and this figure was not here at all. Finally, the other major portrait we see is this figure here, who is Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a mathematician, and he has the portrait of Michelangelo. Interestingly enough, this figure is also not in the cartoon, the full-scale drawing of the School of Athens. And it's hard to tell in this reproduction, but if you go in person, you can see that it's painted in this really distinctive style, very different from all of the figures around it. It's much more Michelangelo-esque, this heavy figure, darker colors. It's almost like Raphael wanted you to think that Michelangelo came over from the Sistine Chapel, saw all of these figures being depicted, saw that he wasn't included, and then in his own style painted himself here. Now that's almost certainly not the case. These two artists did know each other. Michelangelo wouldn't let anybody into the Sistine Chapel, but based on this painting, we know Raphael had to have seen it. The color scheme is very similar. There's many aspects that are directly derived from the Sistine ceiling, so it's likely that Bramante let him in to see the works. So everything about this painting, it's this idea of cooperation and dialogue. There's a lot of speaking going on, this passing and sharing of knowledge, and it's set into this composition. It's very calm, harmonious, dignified, following these Renaissance ideals, which are very similar, you might notice, to classical Greece. Now I'd like to move on to Venice, which is a very different city than Rome or Florence. It's in northern Italy. It's a republic like Florence, but it has an even more distinct personality. It has a very unique self-image, and in its art it combines a lot of Gothic and Byzantine elements. It wasn't a Roman city like so many others. Florence was a Roman city, Rome obviously. Instead, it connected themselves to the later Byzantine part of the Roman Empire. They also created a lot of legends for themselves as a history. They were very self-sufficient through trade. They were a serious naval power. They had large commercial and military fleets. They're very well known for printmaking and publishing books. They're some of the first to exploit the invention of the printing press. Much of their wealth in the medieval period comes from success in the Crusades. So they have a lot of connections with outside cultures, even though they're kind of isolated in this little lagoon up in northern Italy. They have a very distinct approach to color and light in their paintings. Art historians often talk about the differences between central Italy and Venice as being between disegno and colore. Disegno is design or drawing, which was very important to central Italian artists, versus the color of the Venetians, which they used that as the way to make their forms. Venetians, of course, draw, but they largely develop their compositions through the process of the application of paint. And they are very big proponents of the medium of oil. The climate is more appropriate for oil painting than for fresco, and the color and atmospheric effects are greater than tempera allows. So what I'm showing you here is a very typical Venetian altarpiece from the late 1400s. It's by Giovanni Bellini. It's called the San Giobbe altarpiece because of the church that it used to be located in. It's now in a museum in Venice. And it gives you a really good sense of the sensuous color that the Venetians used. We have a composition here called a Sacra Conversazione, a sacred conversation, where you see saints from various time periods gathered together. You even have a little orchestra of angels, all surrounding the Virgin and Child on this large monumental architectural throne. So this event could never have happened, but it's inspired by whatever the patron wanted. Maybe these are the name saints for the patrons. It's a very common type of devotional image. So it's not a narrative. It's not trying to tell you a story. Bellini is famous for his Madonnas and these Sacra Conversaziones that we're seeing here. And it's this very distinctive use of color and light, very harmonious and balanced. which lends it this atmosphere of stillness and calmness. The light is sort of suffused across the surface of the painting. It's soft and luminous, and it has this glowing color which the artist is able to achieve by applying very thin glazes of oil paint and building up color over time. You can see that even in Venice there's this strong interest in the use of perspective in an attempt to create a naturalistic space. So you can get a sense of this continuing the architecture of the altar tabernacle. You can see the cornice here going back into an apsed niche. You can see the coffering of the ceiling. In the space above the apse niche, the semi-dome space, you can see a mosaic, and oil painting and the Venetian approach is perfect for rendering the glittering atmosphere that mosaics allow, and Venice was known for its mosaics. This looks almost exactly like almost any Venetian church interior, so he's very consciously thinking about where this is going to be placed. So you can see these sort of holes, you can see the shape that it used to be contained in. See this little triangular shape on each side? That's how it fit into the altar tabernacle, the frame created for it on the wall of the church. And you can see how the cornice extends from that to these fictive painted pilasters that are in the painting. So this luminosity is very characteristic of Venice. Just to compare for a second different approaches to the depiction of the Madonna and Child, on the right side I'm showing you an example of this Madonna and Child with a young Saint John by Raphael. So Raphael's painting comes a little bit later, but I think it's a really nice comparison showing how different Central Italian approaches are versus Northern Italian. Now, of course, the Madonna is still wearing the same color scheme. It's very typical for her to be seen that way, but you don't see him using light in the same way that Bellini does. There's a stronger emphasis on the forms, on the drawing of the environment in that landscape that should remind you quite a bit of the Mona Lisa. Notice the atmospheric perspective there. He's put it out in nature, and he's trying to make things look as naturalistic as possible. Now, Bellini is trying to approach naturalism in a different way, really focusing on the recreation of the space rather than in perfectly naturalistic bodies, although as you can tell it is quite naturalistic as well. I also want to talk about the painter named Titian, and I'm showing you here one of his most famous paintings called Venus of Urbino. Titian was a very prolific artist who traveled pretty extensively throughout Italy. He worked for a number of different patrons, and he was one of the first artists where patrons or collectors were saying, I want a painting by Titian, not commissioning a specific work, but instead just saying, I want something by him. This work of art was painted for the Duke of Urbino, hence why it's called the Venus of Urbino. But the name Venus is actually quite misleading, because this is not supposed to be a depiction of the goddess. We're not sure of the exact identity of the woman here. Is she a courtesan, which was sort of a high-end prostitute, or is she supposed to be his wife, mistress, or bride? But I hope you can see that the Venus associations are quite clear here. The nude female form. We call this nude rather than naked because she's very decorously arranged. She's got her arm draped across her legs. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. She's got this bracelet on, but it's not scandalous in any way. And even though she's looking out at us, her gaze is rather passive. She's making eye contact, but it's not harsh in any way. This is meant for a private audience, for the Duke and the Duke alone. It's based on an earlier example by the artist Giorgione, which your book illustrates, and Giorgione was Titian's teacher, and his painting of a sleeping Venus was very famous. So we see a rise in this period of the reclining female nude, and this is something that we're going to see again. So she's a sensuous and idealized nude figure. Her form is perfect. There are no flaws in the body. She's looking out at the viewer in a seductive way, and it's not exactly demure, but it's also not very confrontational. She's this very soft skin, which contrasts with the textures of everything around her, the sheet she's lying on, this coverlet of the bed, the velvet curtain behind her, the wooden wall, the tapestries hanging in the background. We see two maids in the background who are digging around in these large chests, probably pulling out clothes for her. You can see this dress thrown over her shoulder. We have a couple of symbolic things going on here. For example, she's holding these roses, which were an attribute of Venus, the goddess of love. We also see this dog curled up asleep on the bed. Remember, dogs can be both a symbol of fidelity, but also of carnality. So this is representative of sex, essentially. One other thing that makes her distinctly not Venus is her setting. So I mentioned the women in the background, but this is exactly what women in the Renaissance would have been wearing. The architecture of the room with this open window with the column looking out to the landscape, the tapestries on the wall, this wooden barrier separating the two spaces of the room. This is what a contemporary interior would have looked like. Now let's talk about her hand for just a second. Now this is usually a little easier talked about in person in a classroom, but I'll do my best on lecture. Now most people would say that's a sort of modest gesture, but once you start thinking about all of the other elements in the painting, maybe it's not so modest at all. Remember, this is a private picture for the Duke and the Duke alone, of his mistress, of his bride, of a courtesan, we don't know. But this is all about sex. And her hand is probably not still, if you catch my drift. So, it's this very sexual painting in a lot of ways. We see this beautiful nude, which is a specialty of Titian and becomes very influential for centuries. We will bring this painting up again later. Because he's from Venice, you have this beautiful color with warm and rich colors, this luminous quality to it. He uses glazes just like Bellini to give it this luminosity. It's a bit more painterly. You can start to see the brushstrokes a little bit, but you can see the interest in the surface texture, almost like the Northern European artists. It's a more dynamic composition than what we were seeing before. We've got her body as this strong diagonal. You've got this vertical feature here and some horizontals included as well. But notice, she's very inviting. This diagonal makes it very approachable. So Titian is a very important painter, and unfortunately I'm only going to show you this example, but it's a very important painting for the history of art. I do want to talk about one example of architecture because I've been talking about classicism and looking to the ancient past as this idea of a renaissance, a rebirth. Here I'm showing you what's called the Villa Rotunda by an architect named Andrea Palladio, and this is placed just outside the city of Vicenza and dates to 1566 to 1570. Palladio is one of the most famous Renaissance architects. He was from northern Italy, the city of Padua, but he went to Rome twice, and he even illustrated an edition of Vitruvius. Now, Vitruvius is the only architectural treatise that survives from antiquity, so Renaissance architects were very, very interested in what Vitruvius had to say, but there were no illustrations, so they had to try to compare it with surviving ruins. And Palladio illustrates one of these editions that's published in the Renaissance, so he studied it very carefully. He also studied ancient architectural remains and reconstructed them in some of his drawings. He also published a treatise on architecture called the Four Books of Architecture. He talks about antiquity, but he also talks about his own works and includes drawings and plans of his own projects. He works on a lot of villas, which are these country estate houses. So he did this for a Venetian cleric, a priest, who would live in Venice, but on vacation would go out to Vicenza, which is about an hour-long train ride today. And he would go out there, and this was his summer residence. So they're pleasure houses, essentially. They don't need to be quite as functional as a normal palace. Palladio here looks to ancient temple architecture, and I hope by looking at this, the Pantheon springs to mind. We've got the Ionic columns supporting porticos, one on each side, which you can see in the plan here. This all backs up to this square centrally planned space, all of which, as you can see from the plan, is organized around this rotunda, the space below the dome. Now, of course, it's much smaller than the Pantheon. The dome is quite shallow, but it's supposed to remind you of that. So these men of learning would have recognized the reference to the Pantheon and to classical antiquity. The classical entrance, no matter which way you approach the building, gives a certain dignity to it. It's also placed quite high on a hill. This view of it doesn't really give you that idea, so it can be seen from very far away, but also that allows anybody on the porch to see well into the countryside. There's a strict symmetry in the plan, which is characteristic of both classical Greece and Rome and the Renaissance. In the interior, all of the spaces are connected. You can see all of the doorways perfectly line up in this very symmetrical patterning, and again, all built around this rotunda area. But remember, this is this purely recreational building, this country house, so this classicizing architecture was perfect for that. It was a way to sort of show off your erudition to your friends. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the style called mannerism, and I'm only going to show you one example of this, although your book depicts quite a few more. This emerges in the 16th century, follows the High Renaissance, and it lasts through the entirety of the rest of the 16th century. And of course, not everybody paints in this style, but it becomes very common. One art historian refers to it as the stylish style. Some people say mannerism starts as early as the death of Raphael in 1520. It derives from this Italian word maniera, which translates as the word style or manner. So it's this very carefully thought out approach to painting, which takes on this affectation. It loses some of the naturalism of the High Renaissance. It's a very intellectual style. There's a lot of artifice and a conscious revelation of a constructed mode of art. So it becomes more about the invention of the artist, what the artist can come up with, rather than showing the strict observation of nature that many painters in the High Renaissance were so interested in. Stylistically, some of its characteristics include unbalanced compositions. Often they're pushed really in the foreground. You don't have a lot of receding space. There's a lot of unusual complexities. There's ambiguity in the space, the content, and the meaning. And again, this movement away from pure naturalism and moving away from balance and symmetry, again, for showing off artistic and intellectual skills. This is the point in time that artists are trying to prove themselves as intellectuals rather than craftsmen. So in showing that they can derive these interesting compositions and have these sort of things stored in their memory, how to draw a human figure, was seen as this virtuosic technique. It's hard to unify as a single style because there were so many different characteristics. You often see very strange color incorporated into these, weird positions of figures that just don't make a lot of sense. The artists are just trying to invent new things, basically. It was stimulated and supported by court patronage. It began in Florence and Rome, and it starts out in painting, but then it moves on to other media types, especially architecture. So I'm showing you a work by an artist named Parmigianino, which basically means little guy from the city of Parma. This painting is called the Madonna of the Long Neck. I think you can guess why, and it dates to about 1535. So what we're seeing is the Madonna, this very large central figure, much bigger than all of the rest around her, and this enormous Christ child. You can't even call him the baby Jesus really here because he is, I don't know, the size of a 5-year-old, something like that. I guess it makes sense because she is enormous. It's hard to tell what they're sitting on. Parmigianino doesn't really give us any indication. It seems like it's probably a throne, but the only thing we can actually see supporting them are these cushions that she rests her foot on. She has a very elongated body, and her proportions are as well. You see the long neck, the very long and tapered fingers. Now imagine if she stood up, if she didn't have this baby in her lap, how enormous her hips would be supporting this figure. There are some strange elements in this painting that are not quite explainable. One of those things are the figures over to her left. Are they angels? They don't have any wings. They're just these beautiful little figures. They all sort of look alike. Parmigianino has very distinctive faces. We don't know who they're supposed to be. There are all sorts of weird objects that we can't really identify. There's this jar that this figure is presenting. You can kind of get a sense of a little cross on it. And that probably derives from who the patron is, a woman named Elena, which is the Italian version of Helen. And St. Helen, who is Constantine's mother, was said to have found the true cross. So that's probably what this is referring to. It's strange for this figure to have her leg, her leg, not sure, completely exposed. There's this sensuality to it. And especially you can see the sensuality in the figure of the Madonna. Do you see how her clothes cling to her? You can see her navel completely. This is a good example of not a conscious revival, but of the use of what we would call wet drapery in classical sculpture. Her breast is perfectly delineated under the clothing. There's almost an emphasis on the breast there. The column in the background and the figure in the background are quite strange. It's thought that this is probably supposed to be a prophet, But where is he in relation to these figures? This must recede extremely quickly into the background. The column doesn't make sense with what's going on down on the ground. You've got all these column bases. You can probably tell now by looking at this in the background, though, that it is an unfinished painting. So maybe Parmigianino would have added a number of other elements that would have reconciled some of these issues. So with this elongated figure, you also have the elongation of the figure of Christ here. Now notice he's asleep. Now, if you ever see a sleeping Christ child on the lap of his mother, it's supposed to recall the composition of a Pietà, and Michelangelo's Pietà should spring to mind from your textbook, with the dead adult Christ lying in his mother's lap. His eyes closed, the sleeping baby is supposed to be seen as a foretelling of the death of Christ. This form of the Pietà was a well-known image, and this is presented in a manner, Parmigianino's painting, that was calculated to unsettle the viewers to a certain extent. Now let's talk about her neck for just 1 minute. The column in the background and her neck may be based on a medieval hymn that compared her neck to a slender column. There's possibly several sources woven together into this work that could only be deciphered by very learned individuals. So mannerism, the paintings that we see from mannerism, is this way for the viewer to kind of show off how much they know, how smart they are, what connections they can make to other art. So it's a sort of game. Think back to Mantegna and Ludovico Gonzaga's game in that oculus of the Camera Picta. So painters are trying to incorporate their viewers in new ways. And just to give you a simple comparison, just to show you how far we've come from Duccio's painting in the central area of the Maestà from the very early 1300s to the 1530s. We've moved completely away from this Byzantinizing style. We have very different media here. There's less that makes sense with Parmigianino's painting, and that's not to say that this is a bad thing, but that is just what patrons and viewers wanted at that point, and the artists were very interested in showing their own invention in this period in a way that Duccio could not possibly have done. The status of the artist is changing pretty considerably in this period. So just to wrap up, some of the things we talked about today are the importance of classicizing models in painting, in sculpture, and in architecture. I showed you mostly religious art, but we also see some interest in secular works, especially in something like Titian's Venus of Urbino, not actually Venus, but a portrait of an unknown woman that would have been for the Duke of Urbino's viewing only. I also hope you understood the differences between Central Italian painting and Venetian works, the difference between color versus line, the luminosity that interested the Venetians in a way that the Central Italians weren't so interested in. And finally, we ended with the rise of mannerism, this stylish style showing off the invention of the artist and what he had stored in his arsenal, in his brain from all of his training, what he could come up with. So to finish Module 10, you'll need to take the self-assessment. Then there's a journal entry. You'll find the prompt on Blackboard. And finally, the vocabulary wiki is the responsibility of Group 1 this time. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for the Italian Baroque.